Hi, folks. Today we are talking about the debates that were discussed and compromises that were created while we are ratifying the U.S. Constitution. So make sure that you are on the correct note sheet. This is for notes number 5. And if you remember last video, we talked about the Articles of Confederation and the challenges that our country faced because of the weaknesses of that document. So we know that we need a new document. What are the debates and compromises that surrounded the ratification? That's what we're going to be focusing on today. So your objective is to explain the role and ongoing impact of political negotiation and compromise in the development of the U.S. Constitution. So let's get started. So this is what we left off with in the last video. But just as a reminder, right, we, after Shays' Rebellion, decide to set up the Philadelphia Convention, or the Constitutional Convention, in 1787. And the original plan was to simply revise the Articles. However, it becomes apparent pretty quickly that we need to completely rework our system of government and establish something new. So we're going to see several issues on the agenda, and all of these were hotly debated, and many of them have compromises that we see in the Constitution. So the very first issue, directly as a result of those weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, was to put some more strength behind the national government while still limiting it by the Constitution. And limiting the powers of the states, right? Under the Articles, the national government had been severely limited and the states had all the power. We want to do a little bit more of a flip-flop, right? We want to put more power in the national government, still give some states or the states some power, but not as much as they had. And the question on our mind is, how do we have a government strong enough to really enforce order, but it's not strong enough, not so strong that it violates the rights and liberties of the people? And I do want to, make a note here that just because there was a consensus that something needed to be done about the Articles and the fact that they didn't work, that does not mean that we were all in an agreement on how it should be done, which is why we see all of these debates and compromises and negotiation. We are also going to see the issue of equality and representation pop up, the regulation of slavery, the nature of the executive branch, and how the executive is elected. So these are the issues that our founding fathers are going to debate when they are in Philadelphia. And this political negotiation and compromise is going to significantly impact the development of the Constitution, as we will see through various compromises. So I want to move this up here. Our very first question, let's do some representation stuff. How should the government be set up? That was our first question. And how should states be represented? And we really see a lot of debate surrounding these questions. If you remember from the last couple of videos, representation has been a huge frustration of Americans since we began seeking independence, right? We were being taxed without our consent. We had no representation in Parliament. And this was a hot topic for us. We wanted to make sure that we, no matter where we lived, felt like we were being represented. So we see two plans essentially being put forth at the convention. And the first of those is the New Jersey plan. And the New Jersey plan proposes a unicameral legislative branch. So uni means one, so a one-house legislative branch. And the New Jersey plan also puts forward the idea of representation being equal per state. So no matter the state's population, there would be the same number of representatives. Now, this is going to be favored by your sparsely populated states, your smaller states, because they felt as though that would give them an equal say, an equal footing to those states that had more people. Now, of course, our larger states are not going to be totally for this plan. So the larger states, particularly Virginia, put forward another plan, and this is called the Virginia Plan. The Virginia plan proposes a bicameral legislative branch. So bi meaning two. So it's going to say Congress should be into two pieces, two houses or chambers, and representation should be based on population. So the more populous your state is, the more representatives or representation you had. And this is going to be favored by your bigger states or the more populous states, because they believed that they deserved a stronger voice in making national policy decisions because there were more people, right? It's about proportion. Now, these plans are going to end up being merged into one of the best known compromises at the convention. And this shapes how our legislative branch is really set up. And this becomes known as the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise. And these two plans, we decide to create a bicameral legislature. So we do take that part from the Virginia plan here. And what we do is we create in our legislative branch a Senate and a House of Representatives. And these two chambers or houses make up Congress. Okay. Now, in the Senate, the compromise was, all right, we'll take this piece from the New Jersey plan, the equal representation per state. So in the Senate, each state has the same number of representatives. There are 2 senators per state. So that gives small states some equal footing. Then in the House of Representatives, the representation there is based on population. So we took that key feature from the Virginia plan. Okay. And ultimately, right, when we're looking at this, we see kind of the best of both worlds here, right? The Virginia plan and big states got their population in one of the parts, and New Jersey and the smaller states got equal representation in the Senate. Okay. Another question pops up about representation. And what about slaves? That's the next big thing that the delegates to the convention have to talk about. Do we count slaves toward population, toward representation? So taking a look at this picture, this image, you can just see how this would have been concerning for both the North and the South. Because in the South, right, the bigger the orange square, that means there's more slaves. So the South has pretty large squares. There's obviously more slaves in the South due to the economy, whereas in the North, it's pretty minimal. So, right, the North is concerned about the states in the South getting more power if they count slaves. And the slaves, or the Southern states, of course, want to count their slaves because that would give them more representation. So what we see develop is the 3/5 compromise, right? This is concerning the House of Representatives. This is where this debate is really taking place, right? We know that based on the Great Compromise, representation will be based on population. But how do we count slaves? In the North, the northern states did not want to count slaves toward the population. The South did, okay? What we end up with is a compromise that says, all right, 3 out of every 5 slaves will count toward representation or toward population, toward representation. The idea is for the South, this was a positive because by counting slaves, the voters in those slave states would have a little bit more sway than voters in non-slave states. Now, I don't want you to confuse this idea of counting slaves toward population and representation as the slaves voting themselves. The slaves could not vote in the North or the South. I did just want to kind of clear that up. Now, some of you might be thinking, why 3/5? Like, where did that come from? That number did come from a proposed amendment to the Articles of Confederation, but that was just the number that they set up. Now, this issue is fixed by the 14th Amendment, this issue of only counting a certain proportion of a certain race. That is fixed by the 14th Amendment under the Equal Protection Clause. So to give you an idea of just how important counting slaves toward representation was for the South, take a look down here. In our first House of Representatives, we had 105 seats, okay? Southern states had 47 because they counted slaves as 3/5. Okay? If that had not been put into place and they did not count slaves at all, there would have only been 33 seats for the South. So you can see that bumped them up significantly to having just a little under half of those seats in Congress. So this was very important for the South at the time. Another question that popped up was, should the states or the federal government control and regulate slavery? The compromise is known as the Import and Slave Trade Compromise. And what it says is this: the migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808. And note, this is 20 years after the ratification of the Constitution. So what this is saying is that it's not the federal government that controls or regulates slavery. Congress, the national government, cannot touch that issue until at least 20 years after they ratify this document. Now, what is also important to note about this compromise was that while the southern states got the ability to regulate slavery, the northern states got the agreement that it would be the federal government to regulate interstate commerce. Okay, so that would prevent abuse of power by states from creating exorbitantly large taxes. So we see the federal government responsible for interstate commerce via this compromise. However, they cannot touch the slave trade for 20 years. The election of the chief executive was also something of huge debate. Right? Is that person going to be elected by Congress, those people already in power, state governors or legislatures, directly elected by the people? All of these were possibilities when it came to an executive, right? We knew we needed an executive after the articles failed, but how would that person get into power? And the compromise is the Electoral College. Remember, we are very fearful about a tyrant forming. So we need to think about how can we prevent that. So the compromise was this: each state would have a number of electors. That would be based on the number of representatives that each state has in Congress. So that would be equal to the House of Representatives plus the 2 senators. The people would vote for the electors, who would then place their vote for president. So really, we see this as an indirect way of voting for president. The electors vote for the will of the people from the state that they represent. So what that means is, traditionally, the electors would vote for the state's winner of the popular vote. So in this next election, we've got President Trump versus Joe Biden. Okay? If President Trump wins Ohio, then our electors typically will follow the will of the people and give their electoral votes to President Trump. Now, that is not required, so to speak. There are some loopholes that the electors can get around, and they can go against the will of the people. So as a review, right, I told you guys that these would be popping up throughout the course. If we're talking about this Electoral College kind of being an indirect election of the president, one small group is making a large political decision for the country, what type or model of democracy is represented here? So take a moment and pause if you need to, but make sure that you do think about that and apply this on your notes for me. All right. Another issue is, how can we make sure that the Constitution can be updated as necessary, right? We know that this document, as it's being written, is not perfect. We're going to need to be changing it and altering it and amending it over time. So there needs to be a way to update it as necessary and be adaptable to the current times. And what we come up with is the amendment process, right? We see this debate about self-governance leading to the amendment process outlined in Article 5 of the Constitution. There are 2 methods to this. I have a star next to the first one because this is the most common. And what it is 2/3 of both houses of Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate, will vote to propose an amendment. And then 3/4 of the states have to ratify or approve that proposal. Okay, so 2/3 of both houses propose, 3/4 of state legislatures ratify. Okay, that is the most common method. Now, the second method down here has been used one time only to ratify the 21st Amendment. 23, or not 23, sorry, 2/3 of states could request a national convention to propose an amendment, and 3/4 of state conventions could ratify the amendment. So that is really not a common way of going about it. It's most commonly going to be method number one. But some pattern that you can see here is that it's always 2/3, 3/4, 2/3, 3/4. Now, this amendment process is going to fix a huge problem under the Articles of Confederation, where it was way too difficult to have anything passed, whether that was a law or an amendment that required a unanimous vote. This process right here makes it possible, but not super easy. So, possible enough that we have had amendments pass, but not, too lenient that we have a million amendments, or too hard that we've never been able to pass anything. And there is still more to debate, right? Exactly what powers would the federal government end up having? What powers would states retain? Would the national centralization of power lead to tyranny, right? Should the president, for example, have unlimited terms? These are all questions that are still yet to be answered until ratification. What rights of citizens should be protected. And we have a ways to go in this particular scenario before we get to ratification. And there are still matters, even with the Constitution approved, that still generate discussion and debate today. So in the next video, we will talk about the proposed structure of the Constitution, but we are going to pause here and look at some of these current day discussions and debates that result from the debates and negotiation and compromise in making the Constitution. So your learning objective was to explain the role and ongoing impact of political negotiation and compromise in the development of the U.S. Constitution. So take some time, go back through your notes if you need to, and let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you in class. See you later.